Hello and welcome back. I just finished an exclusive 45-minute test drive of the 2020 ID.4 prototype around the streets of New York City. Unfortunately, I couldn't record the actual video of the drive because of COVID-19 restrictions. Typically, media drives allow day-long drives, sometimes multiple days, but because of COVID-19, Volkswagen had to do things a little differently. The one thing COVID did was add exclusivity. Only 20 members of the media in the entire US were invited, so this was really a rare first look for me of this incredibly important car for Volkswagen. It might be the most important new vehicle introduction for Volkswagen for this year and for quite a few years. Now, while the ID.4 is the second EV from Volkswagen that uses this new MEB platform for electric vehicles. The first was the ID.3, which is a Golf-like hatchback. Volkswagen has a lot more riding on the ID.4. That's because the ID.4 is the vehicle that Volkswagen believes will be its, for lack of a better term, Beetle of the 21st century. It's Volkswagen's true global electric vehicle. It's going to be made in 5 different factories, and one in North America, 2 in Europe, and 2 in China. Volkswagen plans on selling hundreds of thousands of ID.4s per year. Now, to put that into perspective, that's something no other electric vehicle other than the Tesla Model 3 has been able to accomplish. Most other electric vehicles barely sell 100,000 units in their entire life cycle, but Volkswagen wants to sell multiple hundreds of thousands of ID.4s around the world per year. So since this was a prototype, unfortunately, we weren't allowed to take pictures or video of the exterior of the vehicle. And because of COVID restrictions, I couldn't have a whole crew with me there recording video, interior videos, which we were allowed to do. Therefore, I'm now at home recording this about an hour after the drive, so things are fresh in my memory. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to stand here and talk to you the whole time because I know you don't want to look at my ugly mug for 20 minutes or so, however long this video ends up being. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be editing in pictures and video that I took, plus video and pictures that Volkswagen provided me of the ID.4, so that you'll be watching the vehicle as I talk about my driving experience. With that, we're going to jump to the review now. One last thing I'd like to add, if you like what we're doing here on this channel with electric car reviews, range tests, and charging station reviews, please don't forget to click the subscribe button below. First off, before I go into the driving impressions, let's go over the Id4 Basics. The ID.4 will be arriving in Volkswagen dealerships in the US before the end of 2020. The first batch of ID.4s will be what Volkswagen calls the ID.4 First Edition. But if you didn't already order one, you're out of luck. Volkswagen's only making a few thousand First Edition models, and they sold out the very first day they were available to order. In fact, the Volkswagen website crashed because there were too many people trying to connect to it. Once First Edition vehicles are delivered, Volkswagen will begin delivering the ID.4 Pro, which will be available in rear-wheel drive at first for a starting price of $39,995 before any incentives. It will have a 201 horsepower motor and an 82 kilowatt hour battery with a usable capacity of 77 kilowatt hours. Volkswagen estimates an EPA rated range of 250 miles per charge. That sounds a little low for a 77 kilowatt hour battery pack, so Volkswagen may be under promising at this point. In any event, we'll find out soon. One thing I can say about this is when I got into the ID.4 today, the estimated remaining range was 176 miles and the battery state of charge was 66%. That would come out to a range of 267 miles per charge when fully charged. However, without knowing how hard the car was driven on the 34% of the battery that's already used, it's really tough to rely on that estimate. Still, it's promising. Later in 2021, Volkswagen will add an all-wheel drive ID.4 Pro, and that version will add a motor up front for a combined power output of 302 horsepower and have a starting cost of $43,695. All loaded up with the statement and gradient packages, an ID.4 with all-wheel drive can cost up to $49,695 before incentives. Then, sometime in 2022, Volkswagen will begin ID.4 production in its new Chattanooga, Tennessee plant here in the US. That's when they will offer their base model of the ID.4. That's going to cost only $35,000 and have a smaller battery pack. However, we don't have much details on that model just yet. So, getting into the car, the first thing that I noticed is how incredibly roomy the ID.4 is. It's huge inside. It felt slightly more roomy than a Tesla Model Y, which is actually a bigger vehicle than the ID.4, slightly, but it is bigger. One of the main reasons that the interior is so roomy is because Volkswagen decided to forego having a front trunk or frunk, and instead they pushed the air conditioning equipment and other electronics further forward than usual. That allowed the passenger cabin to be elongated, offering more front passenger space. The back seating area is also very roomy with lots of leg and headroom. There's more than 30 cubic feet of cargo space with the seats up, and over 64 cubic feet of cargo space with the 60-40 split rear seats down. The rear seats don't quite fold completely flat, but they do. It's very close to being completely flat, and I don't think that it would be a problem with loading stuff. There are 2 USB-C ports for the front passengers and 2 for the rear passengers, and they also have smartphone pockets in the rear that can hold the rear passengers' devices while they use them or charge them. Up front, there's a 12-way power adjustable leatherette front seats. They're very comfortable. They have these really wide supportive side bolsters. I really liked the feel of it. Sitting in it, it felt like I was really being held in place. More of what I would expect on more of a sports car than a family hauler, but it felt nice and comfortable, and I think that these customers are really going to appreciate the seats on the ID.4. There's 2 interior color choices, Lunar Gray and Galaxy Black. And there's also 2 trim choices, Piano Black and Electric White. All first edition ID.4s have the electric white trim, which personally I didn't care for. As a rule, I don't like white steering wheels. They're impossible to keep clean, and in a couple years, they're going to look terrible. It's just impossible to keep a white steering wheel clean for the long run. Also, I really don't like the white trim that the electric white has on the door panels. If I were to get an ID.4, I'd definitely go with the piano black trim. The ID.4 comes standard with a 10-inch center display. The car I drove had the optional 12-inch one. I haven't seen the 10-inch screen in person, so I can't really say if it's worth it. I know the 12-inch screen was really nice. It's really bright. Pretty easy to navigate. It's much more snappy and responsive than the systems in previous Volkswagens that I've driven. Overall, the ID.4's interior is a bit Spartan, not quite as minimalistic as a Tesla interior, mind you, but there's not too much detail there to love. The armrests and upper dash is nice and padded, but there's still a fair amount of hard plastics throughout. Still, it's definitely more upscale than an ID.3, and it fits in line with the other vehicles in this class and price point. Additionally, all of the buttons below the center display and on the steering wheel of the ID.4, they're touch-sensitive, capacitive. You can also command many of the vehicle's functions with voice control, but while using these touch-sensitive buttons, you get a feedback, and I wasn't really sure if I liked it. That's something that I think I'd have to play with for a few days before I get used to it. I'm sure I'd get used to it. It didn't feel really right the way I was using it for this drive. My initial impressions was I didn't like it, but I think I'd get used to it. The ID.4 also has a dual zone climate control, keyless entry, a wireless mobile phone charger in the center console, and it has a heated steering wheel, which is really important. Another feature it had that I think is really cool was it has a automatic closing sunscreen for the panoramic glass roof, which is optional, the glass roof. But the automatic closing sunscreen was fantastic. One touch and it just closes up on you. I love when cars have these. These giant panoramic glass roofs are fantastic. I have one in my Model 3, but they can get really hot in the summer months when the sun is beating down on them. Even if they're tinted and filter out most of the UV rays, you still get that radiant heat pounding on your head, which I do in my Model 3. And I bought an aftermarket sunscreen that just kind of clips in. I'd love if my car had this automatic closing sunscreen. I think it was a great option for the ID.4. There's a 5.3-inch driver's display, and it's actually attached to the top of the steering column. It moves up and down with the steering column, which just seemed a little odd for me. That could pose a problem with the driver's view with the screen. I noticed if I had the steering wheel down far and my seat up high, the driver's screen was a little obstructed by the steering wheel. So I guess it could be obstructed if it was fixed on the dashboard and you raise the steering wheel up high. So there's no perfect solution to this, but it just seemed a little odd, and I think it could be a problem. The gear shifter was really familiar to me. That's because it's the same type of gear shifter that's used in the BMW i3, which I've owned 2 of. It's located on the right side of the steering column. You basically push the knob forward to go in drive, and you pull it back towards you for reverse. Then there's also a button on the side of the shifter for park. However, Volkswagen's version of this shifter is slightly different than what BMW did for the i3. That's because the shifter also controls the amount of regen the car has. You push the knob forward once to put it in D or drive. You push it twice to put it in B, which the Volkswagen representatives that I spoke to couldn't tell me exactly what B means. They think it's some long German name, but I think it means brake regen mode, so I'm just going to go with that. In drive, the lift-off brake regen is very mild. It's very hard to even feel it. In fact, even in the stronger B mode, the regeneration really isn't quite as strong as I would personally prefer it to be. And the vehicle isn't capable of true one-pedal driving. In fact, there's an artificial creep built in that can't be turned off. So even if you do regen down to nearly stopping, the vehicle will always creep along at a couple miles an hour. I think Volkswagen should change that, and in their software allow the driver to configure their car to shut off artificial creep. I don't mind having artificial creep in a car. Many people prefer it, but give the driver the option of having it or disabling it if they don't like it. The ID.4 does have a blended braking system, so the regeneration is also added when the driver depresses the friction brake pedal. So even though it doesn't have very strong lift-off regeneration, you're still getting the added energy through regeneration when you press the friction brake pedal. I believe it was Volkswagen's goal to try to make the ID.4 an easy transition from conventional ICE cars. And that's why it has the weaker lift-off regeneration, but you combine that with the blended brakes, and then what you do get is you get a good amount of regeneration. You're not sacrificing efficiency. Tesla, by comparison, has strong lift-off regeneration, but they don't have a blended braking system. When you touch the friction brake pedal, you're using the friction brakes. With the Volkswagen ID.4, when you depress the friction brake pedal, unless you press it really hard, what's going to happen is the regen is going to increase and the friction brakes won't be activated unless the vehicle decides it really needs it, or if you're pressing it really hard for an emergency stop. The ID.4 has 4 driving modes: Eco, Comfort, Sport, and then there's a custom setting that can be configured. I used Sport mode for most of my drive, and unfortunately I can't comment on the efficiency because the gauge wasn't working. Remember, this was a prototype ID4 that I drove, and I reset the miles per kilowatt hour gauge when I started, and shortly into my drive I noticed that it remained at 0.00 for the entire trip. So sorry about that. I really can't comment on efficiency, which I was really hoping I was going to be able to. There is one feature that I didn't get to try out because of my limited time. That's Volkswagen's new ID light. Volkswagen explains it by saying the intelligent light concept in the interior supports the driver visually and makes communication with the ID3 or ID4 more emotional. Basically, there's an LED light strip at the base of the windshield that responds to verbal commands and communicates messages like when the doors are locked or unlocked. It also responds to navigation commands. Hopefully I'll get to try this out in the future and play with it for a while. I think it almost could have a review just for this ID light. I'd like to see if it's actually a useful feature or just a gimmick. For now I'm going with gimmick, but when I get a chance to try it out, perhaps my mind will change. As I mentioned, the 45-minute drive in New York City was one of the worst places to get a good feel on how a car drives. You know, although traffic is much lighter these days during COVID, you still don't get the opportunity to really drive the car like you can on open country roads, which is what we usually get to do with media drives. That said, the ID4 lived up to my expectations. You have to remember, Volkswagen isn't going after the Model Y crowd or even the Mustang Mach-E crowd. You know, they see the ID4 as a family mover, an efficient, affordable family mover, and more likely to take away sales from the Toyota RAV4, the Honda CR-V, and the Subaru Forester. And the performance is more than adequate to compete with those vehicles. Volkswagen hasn't published 0 to 60 times yet, but they say to expect somewhere in the mid 7 seconds. And in my time driving with the car, that feels about right. I'd probably say 7.5 to 7.8, 0 to 60. The all-wheel drive version is going to add 101 more horsepower. That should bring the 0 to 60 time down to around 6 seconds, maybe even 5.7, 5.8. In my opinion, that's actually more than fast enough for what the ID4 needs to be. This is a people mover, a family crossover. You don't need a 5-second vehicle for that. It just really gets wasted. Sometimes I think we get too tied up with these high performance figures in EVs. They don't all have to be track cars, and the ID4 isn't one for sure. But what it is though, it's an exceptional family crossover that isn't slow by any means. The steering is responsive. The vehicle handled the potholes in New York City really well. I also noticed the cabin noise seemed exceptionally low. It isolated all of the outside city noise, but I probably never got up over 40 miles an hour during the drive, so I really don't know how the wind noise is going to play at highway speeds. You know, is the ID4 going to be a winner? I think so. Put it up against the RAV4s, the CR-Vs, the Subaru Outbacks of the world. It's as good or better than those are. And it's going to have a much lower total cost of ownership. In many cases, the initial cost might even be less. Here in New Jersey, where I live, the ID4 is eligible for a $5,000 cash on the hood state rebate, in addition to the $7,500 federal tax credit. It also is sales tax exempt in New Jersey, as all BEVs are. I can get an ID4 Pro for $27,500 out the door. And that's without even negotiating anything off the MSRP. That's a fantastic deal for a great EV. Will Volkswagen sell hundreds of thousands of them annually? Not initially, but in a couple of years when all 5 factories are pumping out ID4s and the word gets out on just how good this EV is, then yes, I think they will. The ID4 has the potential to be the Volkswagen Beetle of the 21st century, really being Volkswagen's first electric vehicle that becomes a global bestseller. I'm looking forward to more time with an ID4 where I can perhaps do a more thorough test drive. Maybe once the vehicles are out at the dealerships, I can grab one from a dealership and take one for half a day or so. But until then, I'm impressed. I think the ID4 is going to do well. I think Volkswagen has a winner, and This is just the beginning for the ID brand. All right, so now you know how I think about the Volkswagen ID.4 after a short test drive around the streets of New York City. I'd like to know how you think about it. Has Volkswagen hit the nail on the head? Is this going to be that mass market electric vehicle that sells hundreds of thousands of units per year? Is this Volkswagen's breakthrough EV? Let us know in the comments section below, and please click that subscribe button so you don't miss any upcoming content about my range tests, charging station reviews, and EV reviews. Thanks for watching.